The town of Santa Lucia rested quietly between rolling hills and wide fields of olive trees. It was a peaceful place where life moved slowly and predictably. Most days followed the same rhythm. Farmers worked the land. Children walked to the small village school. And every evening, the church bell rang across the valley as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. For generations, nothing unusual had ever happened in Santa Lucia. But in the spring of 2025, something began that the town would never forget. At the edge of the village stood an old stone chapel built nearly 200 years earlier. The chapel was small and simple, with cracked walls and a wooden door that creaked whenever it opened. Inside stood a statue of the Virgin Mary. The statue had been there longer than anyone could remember. She wore a white robe and a pale blue cloak. Her hands were open in a gentle gesture of welcome. Most people passed the chapel without stopping anymore. Life had become busy, and faith had quietly faded for many. But one person still visited every evening. Her name was Sofia Alvarez. Sofia was 16 years old and lived with her grandmother in a small house near the vineyards. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 9, and since then her grandmother, Maria, had raised her. Maria had taught Sofia something important when she was very young. When life becomes too heavy, she used to say, you can always speak to the mother. So every evening, after school, Sofia climbed the hill to the old chapel. She lit a candle, and she prayed. One evening in early April, the sky above Santa Lucia turned deep orange as the sun began to set. Sofia pushed open the wooden door of the chapel and stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of wax and old stone. She walked to the statue and placed a small candle near the base. But that night, something felt different. The air inside the chapel was strangely still, almost warm. Sofia knelt and closed her eyes. I don't know if anyone is listening, she whispered quietly. But my grandmother is getting very sick. The doctors say they cannot help her anymore. Her voice trembled slightly. I'm not asking for a miracle. I just don't want her to suffer. For a moment, nothing happened. The chapel remained silent. Then Sofia noticed something strange. The candle she had just lit flickered suddenly, even though there was no wind inside the chapel. A soft light began to glow near the statue. At first, Sofia thought the setting sun was shining through the window behind her. But the light was too bright, too steady. Slowly, she lifted her head, and her breath caught in her throat. The statue was no longer alone. A woman stood beside it. She wore a white robe that seemed to glow softly in the dim chapel. A pale blue cloak rested gently over her shoulders. Her face was calm, peaceful, and kind. Sofia froze, unable to move. For a moment, she wondered if she was dreaming. The woman looked at her and smiled gently. Do not be afraid, she said softly. Her voice sounded warm and familiar, like a mother comforting a frightened child. Sofia's heart began to pound. Who are you? She whispered. The woman stepped forward slowly. The soft light around her filled the small chapel. I heard your prayer, the woman said. Tears began to form in Sofia's eyes. You heard me? The woman nodded. I always hear the prayers spoken with love. Sofia felt her hands shaking. You're her, aren't you? She whispered. For a moment, the woman said nothing. Then she simply smiled again. And Sofia suddenly understood. The same white robe, the same blue cloak, the same gentle face as the statue beside them. Her voice trembled. The Virgin Mary. The woman placed a gentle hand on Sofia's shoulder. I am only a messenger of God's mercy, she said softly. Sofia could barely breathe. Why did you come here? Mary looked around the quiet chapel. Because this town has forgotten something important. Sofia frowned slightly. What? Mary's eyes were calm and filled with kindness. Hope. Outside, the evening wind moved through the olive trees. Inside the chapel, the soft light continued to glow. Sofia did not yet realize it. But this was only the beginning. And soon, the entire town of Santa Lucia would witness something no one could explain. Sofia remained kneeling in the small chapel, her heart racing as the soft glow around the mysterious woman filled the quiet room. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind moved gently through the olive trees on the hill. The evening sky was fading from orange to deep blue as night slowly approached. Sofia finally found her voice again. Why did you come to me? She asked quietly. The woman's expression remained calm and kind. Because you were listening, she replied softly. Sofia frowned slightly. Listening? Yes, the woman said. Many people speak prayers, but very few truly listen afterward. Sofia lowered her eyes, unsure what to say. Then she remembered her grandmother lying weak in bed at home. Will my grandmother be okay? She asked. For a moment, sadness appeared in the woman's eyes. Every life is a journey, she said gently. Some journeys are longer than others, but no journey is ever alone. Sofia felt tears forming in her eyes. You mean she's going to die? The woman stepped closer and placed her hand softly on Sofia's shoulder. Do not be afraid of what you cannot control, she said. Then she looked toward the chapel door. The people of this town have forgotten how to care for one another. They have forgotten faith, patience, and compassion. Sofia listened carefully. What should I do? She asked. The woman looked back at her. Tell them what you saw tonight. Sofia's eyes widened. They won't believe me. Mary smiled gently. They do not need to believe you. They only need to remember hope. Just then, the light around the woman began to fade slightly. Sofia felt panic rising. Wait, she said quickly. Will I see you again? The woman looked toward the statue beside them. You will not be alone, she said softly. And then, just as quietly as she had appeared, the light disappeared. The chapel returned to darkness. The statue of the Virgin Mary stood alone again. Sofia sat frozen on the chapel floor for several seconds, trying to understand what had just happened. Finally, she stood slowly. Her candle still burned beside the statue. Everything looked normal again, but something deep inside her had changed. She hurried down the hill toward her house. When she opened the front door, she found her grandmother sitting up in bed. Maria looked stronger than she had in weeks. Sofia, she said softly. Something strange happened tonight. Sofia rushed to her. What do you mean? Maria looked toward the window. I woke up a few minutes ago, she said, and there was a beautiful light in my room. Sofia felt a chill run down her spine. A light. Maria nodded. And a woman was standing beside my bed. Sofia's heart began pounding again. What did she look like? Maria smiled gently. She wore white and a blue cloak. Sofia felt tears filling her eyes. She told me not to be afraid, Maria continued. She said my pain would soon be gone. Sofia sat quietly beside her grandmother. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The next morning, something even stranger happened. Just before sunrise, a farmer named Luis Ortega was driving his truck past the chapel hill when he noticed something unusual. A bright light was shining above the old chapel. At first he thought it was lightning, but the sky was clear. The light hovered above the roof of the chapel, glowing softly in the early morning mist. Luis stopped his truck and stared. Within minutes, 2 more drivers passing along the road saw it too. By the time the sun rose, nearly a dozen people in Santa Lucia had witnessed the strange light above the hill. Word spread quickly through the village. People gathered near the chapel that afternoon, whispering to each other and pointing toward the sky. Some believed it was just sunlight reflecting through clouds. Others were not so sure. That evening, Sofia returned to the chapel. Her hands trembled slightly as she pushed open the old wooden door. Inside, the room was quiet again. The statue stood in the same place. The candles flickered gently. Sofia knelt once more. Are you really coming back? She whispered. For a moment, nothing happened. Then suddenly, a soft light began to appear again beside the statue. And Sofia realized something incredible. She was not the only one who had come that night. Footsteps echoed behind her. Villagers were slowly entering the chapel, and they were about to witness something that would change Santa Lucia forever. The wooden door of the chapel creaked slowly as more villagers stepped inside. At first, only a few people had followed Sofia up the hill that evening. Curiosity had spread through Santa Lucia during the day after the strange light appeared above the chapel. Some came because they were curious. Others came because they were frightened. A few came simply because they had nothing else to do. But none of them expected what they were about to see. The small chapel quickly filled with quiet whispers. The room smelled of candle wax and old stone as villagers stood along the walls and near the wooden pews. Sofia remained kneeling near the statue. Her heart was pounding. She didn't know what would happen. She didn't even know if the woman would return. A man named Carlos Mendez stood near the doorway with his arms crossed. Carlos owned the local grocery store and was known in the town as someone who believed only in facts. This is nonsense, he muttered quietly to the man beside him. People see strange lights, and suddenly it's a miracle. But even Carlos stopped talking when something changed. The candles near the altar flickered suddenly. At first it was only a small movement of flame. Then the air inside the chapel grew strangely warm. A soft glow began to appear beside the statue. The whispering voices in the room slowly faded. One by one, people turned toward the altar. The light grew brighter, soft, golden, and within that light, a figure slowly appeared. Gasps filled the chapel. A woman stood beside the statue. She wore a long white robe that seemed to glow gently in the candlelight. A pale blue cloak rested over her shoulders and moved softly, as if touched by a breeze that no one else could feel. Her face was calm, peaceful, kind. Sofia lowered her head slightly. She knew that presence. But the villagers behind her stood frozen in disbelief. Carlos stared with wide eyes. "That's impossible," he whispered. No one moved. The woman looked around the room slowly, her eyes passing gently across every face. Some people began to cry quietly. Others simply stared. Then the woman spoke. Her voice was soft, but somehow everyone in the chapel heard her clearly. "Do not be afraid." The words filled the room with a calm that no one could explain. A young mother holding a baby began to weep. An elderly man slowly removed his hat and crossed himself. Carlos took a hesitant step forward. "Who are you?" he asked. The woman looked at him with gentle understanding. "I come when people forget hope," she said. Carlos shook his head slowly, trying to understand what he was seeing. "This can't be real." The woman's expression did not change. "Faith is not something that can be proven," she said softly. "It is something that must be remembered." Then her eyes turned toward a woman sitting in the back pew. The woman's name was Teresa Valdez. She had been sick for many years. Walking was painful for her, and most days she could barely stand without help. Mary stepped slowly toward her. The chapel remained silent. Teresa looked terrified. "Why are you looking at me?" she whispered. The woman knelt gently beside her. "You have carried your pain for a long time," she said. Tears rolled down Teresa's face. "Yes." Mary placed her hands softly over Teresa's hands. "Your faith has not been forgotten." For several seconds, nothing happened. The villagers watched in silence. Then Teresa suddenly inhaled sharply. Her eyes widened. Slowly she stood up. At first she looked confused. She took one step forward, then another. The pain that had followed her for years was gone. Gasps filled the chapel. Teresa covered her mouth with her hands. I can walk," she whispered. People stared in shock. Carlos stepped back, completely speechless. The woman in white slowly stood again, but the light around her was beginning to fade. Sofia looked up quickly. "Wait," she said softly. The woman turned toward her. "Remember what I told you," she said. "Hope must be shared." Then the light slowly disappeared. The chapel returned to its quiet candlelight. The woman was gone. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then suddenly the room filled with voices. People cried. Others prayed. Teresa stood in the center of the chapel, still trembling as she realized she was standing without pain. Carlos looked toward the statue of the Virgin Mary. For the first time in his life, he knelt. But outside the chapel, someone else had also witnessed the strange light that night. And by morning, the story of Santa Lucia would begin spreading far beyond the quiet hills of the village. Because a reporter was already on his way, and he was determined to discover the truth. By morning, the quiet village of Santa Lucia was no longer quiet. Word about what had happened in the chapel spread faster than anyone expected. By sunrise, people from nearby towns were already arriving. Cars filled the small road leading up the hill. Some came because they believed. Others came because they were curious. And some came because they wanted proof. Among them was a journalist named Daniel Romero. Daniel worked for a national news network in the capital. He had spent years reporting on strange stories and unexplained events. In most cases, he eventually discovered the truth behind them. And usually, the truth was simple. Rumors, misunderstandings. Sometimes, even people pretending to see things that were never there. When Daniel arrived in Santa Lucia, he expected this story to be no different. He parked near the bottom of the hill and walked up the dusty road toward the chapel. A small crowd had already gathered outside. Some people were praying quietly. Others spoke in excited whispers. Daniel pulled out his camera and notebook. "Who saw the light last night?" he asked. Several hands immediately pointed toward the chapel door. "It was inside," someone said. A woman appeared, another villager added. Daniel wrote quickly. "And you're saying she looked like the Virgin Mary?" A man standing nearby nodded. She healed Teresa Valdez, he said. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Healed? The man pointed toward the chapel steps. Teresa was standing there, speaking with several villagers. She was smiling in a way that people in the town had not seen for many years. Daniel approached her. I'm a reporter, he said politely. I was told something unusual happened to you. Teresa looked at him calmly. Something wonderful happened, she replied. Daniel glanced at her legs. You had difficulty walking before? For 15 years, she said. And now? Teresa took a slow step down the chapel stairs. Then another. Now I don't. Daniel stared silently for a moment. He had interviewed many people before who believed they had experienced miracles. But Teresa did not look confused. She looked certain. Still, Daniel remained skeptical. Sometimes emotions can make people feel better temporarily, he said carefully. Teresa smiled gently. You can believe whatever you want, she said. Then she turned back toward the chapel. As the day passed, the crowd around the hill continued to grow. By evening, nearly 200 people had gathered near the small building. Some knelt in prayer. Others waited quietly. Daniel stayed as well. Part of him expected nothing to happen, but another part of him was curious. Just before sunset, Sofia arrived again. The villagers recognized her immediately. Word had spread that she was the first person to see the mysterious woman. People stepped aside as she walked toward the chapel door. Daniel watched carefully. Inside, the room filled slowly with villagers and visitors. The candles near the altar burned softly. The statue of the Virgin Mary stood quietly in the same place it always had. Sofia knelt near the front once more. The entire chapel waited. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Daniel checked his watch. Then suddenly, the candles flickered. A soft murmur moved through the room. Daniel looked up quickly. The air inside the chapel felt strangely warm. And then the light appeared again. It began near the statue, just as people had described. Soft at first, then brighter. The room fell completely silent. Daniel slowly lifted his camera. But when the figure appeared beside the statue, his hands began to tremble. The same woman. White robe, blue cloak. Calm and peaceful. No one spoke. The woman looked around the room. Then her eyes rested briefly on Daniel. For a moment, he felt something he could not explain. Not fear. Not confusion. Something deeper. A quiet calm. The woman spoke softly. People search for signs, she said. Her voice seemed to echo gently through the chapel. But the greatest sign has always been love. Some people began to cry quietly. Others bowed their heads. Mary continued speaking. Care for one another. Forgive one another. And never lose hope. Her eyes moved slowly across the room. Then the light around her began to fade once again. Before disappearing, she looked towards Sofia one final time. Thank you for listening, she said. And then she was gone. The chapel returned to silence. Daniel lowered his camera slowly. For the first time in his career, he had no explanation. He stepped outside into the cool evening air. The sun was disappearing behind the hills of Santa Lucia. People were already telling each other what they had seen. Some prayed. Some cried. Others simply stood quietly, trying to understand what had happened. Daniel looked back toward the small chapel on the hill. He knew the story would soon spread across the country, perhaps even the world. But what stayed with him most was not the mystery. It was the feeling he had experienced when the woman looked at him, a calm he had not felt in many years. And as the church bell rang across the valley that evening, the town of Santa Lucia understood something they had forgotten long ago. Sometimes miracles are not meant to convince the world. Sometimes they are simply meant to remind people of hope. And in a quiet chapel on a hill, hope had returned.